Hello Politics 1A. We are now starting with part 3 of theme 11. This part looks at transitional justice and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in a South African context. Please note that this section is extremely important for the exam. Now, important questions anybody should ask when dealing with anything to do with transitional justice are the following. What is justice? How does one heal a nation after a brutal conflict characterized by gross human rights abuses, such as the apartheid years? Is it morally acceptable to torture someone when fighting a just war? What is a just war? And when can human rights abuses be excused in the name of justice, if they can ever be excused? Now, all of these questions are important, but in the interest of time and saving your data, I won't spend time discussing these questions now. You can ask me these questions and we can discuss them in the Collaborate Ultra classes where we do discussion on the lectures that have already been posted. The important sections that you have to know for the exam will be the only ones focused on now in this recording. So that will be defining transitional justice, discussing the differences between restorative and retributive justice approaches, identifying which approach South Africa chose, explain the purpose of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and note the outcomes of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, both sets of these definitions of transitional justice are important. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to let you read those for yourself. But remember, I'm going to pick out some keywords here. Judicial and non-judicial measures can be used to redress the legacies of massive human rights abuses. These could be criminal prosecutions, truth commissions, reparation programs, and various kinds of institutional reforms. From the second definition below, an important point would be achieving a sense of justice for victims of human rights abuses. Perpetrators then have to acknowledge and account for their actions of gross human rights violations. So what transitional justice tries to do is create a collective narrative of human rights violations and abuses on the one hand, and on the other hand, it seeks to hold perpetrators of these abuses responsible and accountable for their actions. All of those are important keywords that you would have to include in an answer. Now we don't have time, unfortunately. Now we don't have time to discuss these images, but the first person to email me with where these images represent, so this slide, and this slide, will get a bonus mark on their semester test too. So what can be used as tools of transitional justice? Countries can take people to the International Criminal Court. There could be criminal prosecutions by ad hoc courts or existing courts. There could be formal sanctions. Reparations could be made to people who might have lost loved ones or lost property. Investigations could be conducted by truth commissions. There could be institutional reform, like the establishment of formal human rights oversight, like a public protector, which was what happened in our case. There could be immunity provided, though, also through amnesties and pardons, and there could be other limits on accountability and punishment. You won't have to discuss this section in the exam, but I wanted you to know that there are different kinds of traditional reconciliation ceremonies throughout the world, and these are some of them. For example, the Mato Oput ceremony in northern Uganda. People also use prayers, meditation, music, and dance. There are various forms of ceremonies, like in Sierra Leone, where water is used to cleanse ex-soldiers and give them a cool heart, in other words, to rub out the fire in their hearts and give them a cool heart. And then rebuilding. And you can have a look at this PDF document to see more about these. But again, this will not be examined, but it's just interesting for you to know what kinds of traditional ceremonies there are for transitional justice. Now, this section is important, guys, so make a note, please. There will always be an inherent tension between retribution, which means punishment, and restorative reconciliation, which focuses on forgiveness and nation building. So on the one hand, punishment and retribution are supposed to lead to reconciliation, so tribunals see that justice is done. They establish the truth of what crimes have been committed and by whom, and they individualize guilt. Does anybody see any potential problems with this? We can discuss in a Collaborate Ultra meeting. Advocates of tribunals argue that they act as a deterrent against future human rights abuses, that criminal actions against human rights violators is actually a duty under international law. It breaks the cycle of impunity that leads to perceptions of injustice. Through tribunals and criminal courts, vigilante actions, that is, by the public, against perpetrators are avoided because perpetrators are accounting for their actions in a legal way. And it also individualizes guilt by removing perceptions that a whole ethnic group or communities responsible for human rights violations and attributed that guilt to specific people who commit human rights violations or atrocities. On the other hand, restorative approaches to justice are associated with non-tribunal methods. So this kind of justice looks at truth commissions and ritualistic ceremonies that are underlined by the principle of national healing, which is the focus. So it's not punishments, it's forgiveness and healing that's the focus. And the use of non-tribunal truth commissions and what are considered traditional approaches to justice are advocated. So they focus on healing civil society. They're able to trace societal patterns of atrocity, and they help with reconciliation through a process of ritual forgiveness and dialogue, or talking it through. What's important here is that retributive or punishment-based modes of justice are based on Western notions of justice, and the idea that if someone has wronged you, they must be punished by a court of law. But this is not necessarily universally applicable, and countries around the world might choose to do their transitional justice methods in a completely different way, like focusing on reconciliation and forgiveness instead. Now, the aim of any transitional justice approach is social solidarity. In terms of retributive justice, where tribunals are used, a crime against humanity violates law, and as such, those who've broken the law have to be punished. In restorative justice, where truth commissions are used, they see human rights abuses as violating relationships and people, so any intervention must be aimed at restoring that relationship and learning from it so we don't repeat the same criminal behavior in our future. Other differences are that tribunals want to determine guilt or innocence, whereas commissions want to create a story of the atrocities that happened. Tribunals are also limited in the evidence that they hear, and they're bound by facts that can be tested and verified. Because we're talking about sort of courts of law here. Whereas truth commissions not only focus on the facts, but they also rely on the testimony of victims. So that means that each victim can give their own truth or narrate their own life. And this is very important in terms of the healing power of transitional justice. I'm going to skip the slide in the interest of time here and just recap that we know there's a tension between justice and political accommodation in securing a peaceful negotiated transition to democracy. So there are three options when a country decides what process they're going to engage in. One, they could either engage in a collective amnesia, underpinned by the notion of, let's just forgive and forget. Or two, they can use tribunals, underpinned by the notions of retributive justice and an eye for an eye principle. And three, they could use truth commissions, underpinned by the notion of restorative justice and healing through truth-telling and dialogue. So which one did South Africa choose? South Africa went with number 3, truth commissions, underpinned by the notion of restorative justice. This is an important cartoon, guys, just a little bit of a heads up there for you. Now, the purpose of South Africa's TRC was the promotion of national unity and reconciliation, so it was the restorative approach. The TRC had a threefold mandate. 1, they wanted to investigate and report on apartheid-era human rights violations. 2, they wanted to grant amnesty to perpetrators so that there would be a full disclosure. And 3, they would make recommendations regarding reparations. There were specific committees of the TRC, 3 of them: the Human Rights Violations Committee, the Amnesty Committee, and Reparations and Rehabilitation Committee. This section isn't examined, but it's interesting for you to note that when they were looking for truth, they were looking for 4 kinds of truth: factual truth, narrative truth, social truth, and healing and restorative truth. So look at that in your own time, just for your own interest. This slide now is also important, the 4 key outcomes of the TRC. The first was the acknowledgement that apartheid was indeed a crime against humanity, and that its impact went beyond physical torture, but also affected the dignity and rights of the black majority. TRC also found that the main perpetrators of violence were the South African state and the Inkatha Freedom Party. The ANC had also engaged in human rights violations, and the PAC had primarily targeted civilians and was thus accountable also for gross violations of human rights. The TRC produced a 3,500-page report that is seen to be a sufficient truth of the horrors of South Africa's apartheid past. And the TRC also found that the third force that I mentioned in previous videos had intended to undermine a peacefully negotiated settlement in South Africa, but that these individuals were not necessarily acting with the blessing of the National Party at the time. Finally, was the TRC a success or a failure? You will not be asked to speak on this in the exam, but just for yourself, you can ask yourself whether you think it was a success or a failure, because it depended on what the aim was of the TRC. Because there was an issue of the amnesty that was given to perpetrators. This is a sensitive issue. So this last slide, the TRC, was it a success or a failure? It will not be examined, but you can go through my comments here and decide for yourself whether or not the TRC achieved what it was set out to achieve. Because remember, there's also an issue of reconciliation being impossible without real material benefits and actual transformation. So we might have come through the apartheid past into a peacefully negotiated democracy, but does it mean that we've actually dealt with transformation in a way that everybody is able to enjoy the benefits of our new democracy?